Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Juliet Singler coming to you with week 3 of History of Rock and Roll. And I'd like to highlight a few things from your reading this week. You're reading in What's That Sound on pages 77 to 109. After you finish reading and listening to some samples, I would like to ask you to respond to a couple of short essay questions and to take a quiz. Last week we were talking about how to listen to rock and roll, what to talk about when you're listening to music. This week we're going to highlight some of the early figures of rock and roll. I want you to know some of those early artists and also about a change that was happening in the American consciousness as we moved from the 50s to the 60s. So let me just ask you to recall, first of all, what were those early strains of music in rock and roll? What were the 3 forms of music that led up to the formation of rock and roll? Were you thinking about country music? That's right. Remember, we listened to the Carter family's rendition of Can That Circle Be Unbroken last week. Were you thinking about popular music? That's right. That's another important strain of music that helped to form the early beginnings of rock and roll. Popular music, remember, with that A-A-B-A form and beautiful singing, slower tempos as well. Were you also thinking about rhythm and blues? Yes, that was another form of music that led into rock and roll. Rhythm and blues. Remember, rhythm and blues has that blues format, that oftentimes that 12-bar blues or even 8-bar blues pattern that forms the basis of the music. It also has this component that's improvisational. Musicians playing rhythm and blues style will have some part of the music where they'll take that pattern of chords and just improvise some beautiful music over it. Those 3 strains, rhythm and blues, country, and pop, came together to form early rock and roll. Well, remember, rhythm and blues sprang out of African American culture. And in the 1950s, there was a lot of prejudice in this country. There was even segregation in this country at that time. So white parents didn't want their children to be associated with rhythm and blues for that reason, and also because rock and roll had very sexual connotations and sometimes performance styles that they objected to. But as I mentioned, we were coming out of World War II. Our soldiers had come back to this country, and in the 1940s, there was an enormous sense of optimism, of prosperity. There was a growing middle class, and for the first time, teenagers had some extra money to spend on their music, and they decided, we do want to listen to rock and roll. Record companies began to market just to them. Radio programs began to play just for those teenage ears. There is a wonderful segment in this series I like to use for this class. It's a Time Life series called History of Rock and Roll. And in this segment, that segregation is talked about in some detail. So I just want to play a little bit of it. There's some footage of Chuck Berry singing Roll Over Beethoven. Chuck Berry is one of our first great crossover artists. He was the guy that we call the first guitar hero because he showed us that the guitar could be a focal point of early rock and roll. So I'm going to ask you to look at the screen behind me and hear Chuck Berry and also Carl Perkins, another rockabilly artist like Chuck Berry, talk about those early days of segregation.
There was an integration problem in this town and in this part of America. Pretty severe integration problem back then. But there was no integration in music. When you walked up to an old 54, 55 mile Wurlitzer jukebox and it said Blue Suede Shoes, Carl Perkins, white. Blueberry Hill, Fats Domino, black. No, there was no difference. Kids danced to Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis, Carl. Chuck Berry said to me one time, he said, you know, Carl, we might be doing as much with our music as our leaders are in Washington to break down the barriers.
Carl Perkins makes a great point about rock and roll music in those early days, that the music was helping to integrate people in this country across color lines, even more so than the politicians. Chuck Berry was profiled with the song Johnny Be Good. I'm going to invite you to listen to that song on your own, but be sure you get a look at Chuck Berry's famous Duck Walk and some of his guitar stylings, because as I said, he was the first artist to bring rock to the place where they accepted the guitar as the focal point of the ensemble. Fats Domino, another great early crossover artist, with the song Blueberry Hill. I think you probably know this song, but let me just play a little bit of it for you. And listen in his ensemble for that rhythm and blues inspired sound that features the brass instruments. You're going to hear his regular rock ensemble with guitars and drums, but also the brass instruments that you would have heard in the big band era, influenced by rhythm and blues. Yes, you can hear those brass instruments coming in to sweeten the sound, especially the saxophones. That was Fats Domino with with Blueberry Hill from 1956. AABA form, that was borrowed from popular music. He's also well known for the song Ain't That a Shame. Little Richard with Tutti Frutti in 1956 is our next artist. This is a song that's in simple verse chorus form. And in this particular clip, you can see how integrated the dance floor is becoming. They bring out a couple that won a dance contest. So they're in a mostly white club in this little movie, but they're showing off this winner of the dance contest, who is a black couple. And so everybody seems well knit together, enjoying this great early rock and roll. In this same series that we watch in class, Time Life series, History of Rock and Roll, Little Richard says that when he would come to a club, there would be no division among whites and blacks on the dance floor. They would seat the whites in a different place. Perhaps they'd be seated in the balcony of the venue, and blacks would be seated on the ground floor. But when the music started, he said the white kids would just jump over the railing and come down onto the dance floor, and everybody would dance together. But can you imagine what that would have been like as a black artist? You would have had to go in a separate door from the white artist, even if you were the headlining act. And you would have been subject to discrimination all along your tour route as you were getting your music heard by different people. Let's profile another artist. This is Bill Haley and his Comets, another group that had a great appeal across color lines.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around 2 o'clock tonight. But it's that right song. Join me out. Have some fun. When first lights rock around. Rock tonight. Rock, 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 rock. Rock it out. Rock around the clock tonight.
Bill Haley and his Comets, 1955, and this is another song that's in simple verse form. As a lot of these early songs they're either in simple verse form or simple verse chorus. We did hear that one from Fats Domino that was in AABA form. Let's talk a little bit about Elvis Presley. Now, Elvis Presley was another artist that the founder of Sun Records in Memphis said, I knew this guy was going to bring people together. He had a certain way of performing that was very authentic in that rhythm and blues style. And yet he was a white guy that had enormous appeal with the girls, not only the girls, but the parents of those teens that were paying good money to hear rock and roll music in that time. This song is That's All Right. It's the first song that brought Elvis into the public attention. It's in a simple verse form. It's from 1954. Now, this performance is from the 60s, but you can still see Elvis's enormous appeal as an artist. But yeah, Elvis had enormous appeal. He had a bit of a nickname too, because when he performed on stage, he was often shaking those hips. Elvis the Pelvis was sometimes what people called him. And you can see that very easily in this little clip from Jailhouse Rock. All right, so I think you can see what I mean. He was very appealing on stage, and yet for the conservative elements in society, all that hip swinging was a bit too much. In fact, he was on the Steve Allen Show. I'm not going to play it, but you can pull this up on your own. He was on the Steve Allen Show. This was a comedy variety show that was hosted by a comedian, Steve Allen, and Steve, to prevent that hip swaying, asked Elvis to sing the song Hound Dog, and he actually asked Elvis to dress in a tuxedo with gloves on, and on a little stand next to Elvis he placed a hound dog so that Elvis would only be photographed from the waist up and you couldn't see those hips swing. That's how conservative he was. That's what he felt about Elvis's swinging hips. Let's talk about a couple more things before we close. Quite a few things that were causing Americans to have a change of consciousness from the 50s into the 60s. Part of it was that payola scandal. Remember, Alan Freed and Dick Clark were both featured in hearings about payola. Basically, payola is taking money to play songs of artists instead of playing them just on their merit. Now, at the time, that was not illegal, but as a result of these hearings, it became illegal. It ruined the career of Alan Freed, but not Dick Clark. I want you to think about that, read a little bit more about it, and talk about it in your short essay question this week. So that payola scandal caused people to think, you know what, maybe we're not exactly who we think we are as a country. There's certain things that we need to address. Another thing was that there was a mistrust of authority that was developing in the American consciousness. Some of that was due to things like the McCarthy investigations that caused people who were suspected of communist affiliations to be called in front of a Senate investigating committee and talk about their friends who might have similar connections. Well, this investigative process destroyed the careers of many artists, and many Americans felt like it was unjust. Our Constitution, after all, guarantees freedom of speech, and yet these people were not being afforded that privilege. We also saw the deaths of important political and cultural figures. Our president, John F. Kennedy, was murdered in 1963. Martin Luther King, this great civil rights leader, was murdered in 1968. These two people gave people in the United States hope, and suddenly we had no hope. In 1961, we entered into the Vietnam War, a war which many considered to be unjust. All of these things were causing the American consciousness to change.